They say history is shaped by the victors, but in the long twilight of the Horus Heresy, it was often shaped by the profundity of betrayal. Following the brutal campaign known as the Shadow Crusade, the Wordbearers had become perhaps the most committed of all Traitor Legions in their devotion to the pantheon of the Dark Gods. But their commitment did not always mean loyalty, and in the case of Primarch Lorgar Aurelian, the first of the heretic Primarchs, it became a path of treachery, even amongst the traitors. Though it was Lorgar who first opened the door to chaos, by the time the final drive on Terra had come, he had come to see Horus Lupercal, the appointed Warmaster, as an utter and complete failure. The Warmaster's refusal to fully embrace the Dark Gods disgusted Lorgar above all else, as he claimed to have seen the inevitable defeat that Horus would bring upon them all. Quietly, coldly, and connivingly, Lorgar resolved to kill the man he had once raised to a divine status. The opportunity came in the aftermath of Horus's crippling injury at Beta Garman. The Warmaster lay injured upon the vengeful spirit, sustained only by the desperate loyalty of his inner circle. It was then that Lorgar arrived, not alone, but accompanied by his zealous dark apostle known as Zardu Lyrak. The purpose of this visit was cloaked in protocol to help gather the Traitor Legions at Ulnor for their final campaign, but it masked a far darker ambition, as not all Traitor Primarchs had answered Horus's summons. Perrabo, Angron, along with Fulgrim, each had strayed from the warpath, so Lorgar proposed a division of labor in order to get everyone in line. Peterabo was to retrieve Angron, while he himself would seek out Fulgrim. What followed was no mere strategic detour, as Lorgar and Lorak, along with a cadre of wordbearers, guided by an oracle bearing the soul shard of Crane Berylatan, plunged into the twisted arteries of what is known as the Webway. Their destination was directly at the center of the Eye of Terror. There, beyond mortal space, they found Fulgrim within the pleasure palace of Slaanesh, enthroned in excess and locked in perverse communion with the keeper of secrets known as Nekir. Fulgrim refused to abandon his pleasures for war. What began as parley swiftly descended into violence, as Lorgar faced Fulgrim in a battle, holding his own long enough for Lorak to invoke a secret weapon. Fulgrim's true name would amount to a demon-binding incantation, which Lorgar had learned through an unspeakable ritual. But the curse of the true name, in essence, would erase the knowledge from the speaker's mind. So Lorgar gave it to Lorak, and Lorak spoke it. With Fulgrim now bound to his will, Lorgar now possessed a powerful demon Primarch puppet. The Emperor's children were then summarily gathered, and together the Wordbearers and the Emperor's children would arrive on Ulnor. But the plan was already unraveling at its seams, as Horus had recovered, barely, through the sacrifice of his equerry, Malagoth. And once he came back, he was changed, as reports from survivors described the Warmaster's form as no longer solely human, but shifting in a form of flesh and shadow, anchored by a vast maw of raw, warp energy at its very core. Still, Lorgar pressed on with his original plan. His scheme was brutal in its simplicity, a mass sacrifice of mortal followers to unleash a psychic scream to paralyze Horus. Fulgrim, under Lyrak's control, would then strike, as the sons of Horus would be slaughtered in orbit, and Lorgar would ascend not just to the rank of Warmaster, but as a true and only deserving chosen of chaos, a veritable ever-chosen. But fate, or rather something darker, intervened. The same Chaos Oracle who had guided Lorgar to Slaanesh's palace had warned Horus of his plot, and when Lorgar stepped on Ulnor's blackened soil, Horus attacked, leading to the psychic scream never being uttered. And then the final betrayal. Zardu Lyrak released Fulgrim from his bindings, and no command would be given, and no blow would be struck. Horus then beat Lorgar savagely and hurled him to the ground, as he commanded him to fight back. But Lorgar did not rise. He looked upon Horus's monstrous form and declared only pity. "You are no longer what you were," he spoke, and that was the end. Horus spared him, but only barely. He warned that if Lorgar ever returned, he would surely die. The 5,000 wordbearers that had followed Lyrak as a veritable chapter remained loyal to Horus and would then go on to fight at Terra. As for Lorgar, he vanished, seeking ever more perverse chaos rituals in order to give him a chance at slaying the Warmaster when he was weakened from his fight with the Emperor, as he would take the remaining word-bearers away from the battlefield, sparing the large majority of his legion. And he would go so far as to at one point predict that Horus would fail because he lacked the strength to truly serve the dark gods. And his prediction would prove quite chillingly true. As the Horus Heresy deepened, it did appear that the word-bearers took part in a myriad of campaigns across the breadth and span of the heresy. In 007 through 017 M31, in the smoking aftermath of the Caliph atrocity, the word-bearers committed one final act of calculated malevolence. They triggered the active collapse of the Viridia star itself. Slowly, the sun would begin to die, casting Caliph into a perpetual twilight of radiation and decay. But the war had not ended. The stranded Ultramarines and traitor word-bearers alike would be locked on a nigh-perpetual unforgiving struggle as they took their battles deep beneath the earth. Into the arcology network, these were subterranean tunnels, now veritable catacombs, in a battle that would last a decade. This was the underworld war which would rage on in those lingering depths, as the rest of the heresy would move on without them. No surrender was offered, no quarter would be given. Only when the last word-bearer was hunted down and slain did silence return to the catacombs of Caliph. Up next would be the second Battle of Paramar in 008 to 0011 M31. The Sons of Lorgar stood shoulder to shoulder with the Sons of Horus and the infernal titan forges of the Dark Mechanicum, as on the beleaguered world of Paramar 5, Loyalist forces attempted a reclamation, one that was met with a firestorm of resistance. The strategic Battle of Paramar was primarily its forge works and orbital anchorages, and it meant neither side could afford to yield this world. The word-bearers, now masters of corruption and psychological warfare via the use of infernal Neverborn as weapons, held the line with a resolve that they were, quite frankly, unknown for having. Up next is the defense of Nagathar in 009 M31. Far across the ruin-storm severed Imperium, a desperate conclave of Loyalist forces found refuge in the Nagathar system, amongst them elements of the Dark Angels, Imperial Fists, and a myriad of other human elements, hardened and scattered survivors of countless worlds and engagements, banded together within the system. However, respite was fleeting, as the word-bearers had also come to Nagathar, not just to kill, but to feed. The millions who lived in this system were to be sacrificed in dark rites. They were feeding the warp in the currency it most desired, blood and living sacrifices. Yet, united by a shared enemy, the Loyalists stood firm, denying the traitors their prize. However, it must be noted that the cost was immense, as true victory was uncertain. Merely 1 year later, the scouring of the Gideon Star would occur. Near the galactic core, on the ragged borders of Imperium Secundus, the Blood Angels found themselves embroiled in a brutal campaign against the scattered forces of the Word-Bearers. What had begun as a pursuit turned into mutual annihilation, as 7 colonized worlds fell under the sway of the Dark Apostles. 7 times the Blood Angels answered with fire, blade, and brimstone. As no quarter would be given, no mercy would be had, and there would be blood, enough to slake the red thirst for many a year. By the end, both legions were functionally shattered, and a cadre of the Word-Bearers' own titans were laid low, and the Gideon Stars would become mostly silent. Then, in 011 M31, the Battle of Zepeth would occur. Driven by obsession, Lionel Johnson hunted the elusive Conrad Kurz across the stars, and the trail led him to the Zepeth system, now a stronghold for the Word-Bearers and their blood-maddened allies, the World Eaters. It was there that Faith Red Loss of the Dreadwing would lead the hunt. In Numinith, Zepeth's capital, the Dark Angels discovered scenes of ritualistic horror, twisted sacraments, butchered bodies, and amalgams of flesh and madness that should never exist in the mortal realm. The response to this was rather standard in their uncompromising methodology. The combined traitor garrison would be annihilated, and Zepeth, bloodied and broken, was left to be claimed by its traumatized survivors. The next incident would occur in 013 M31. In the galactic northeast, within the scattered dominion of storms, Arcades Odenthus, Captain Praetor of the Ultramarines 10th, rallied what remnants he could. Scattered loyalists answered the call, and together they launched a rather daring strike on the Word-Bearers held world of Honorum. For 3 dreadful weeks, the Loyalists carved a bloody path through the defenders. Unfortunately for the traitors, their cries of aid were only met with silence, as Horus had already turned his sights to Terra, and the word-bearers were left to stand or fall alone. Desperation would give birth to depravity, as demons, warp-spawned infiltrators, and weapons dredged from the forbidden vaults of old night would be brought into use, as this battle would surpass all limits of endurance and sanity. And when the last traitor lay broken amongst the rubble, no true victory was claimed, as Hornorum, once a radiant world, had become a poisoned, abysmal ruin. The land itself, forever tainted, would bear testimony to the horrors unleashed upon its surface. Each of these battles marks a descent, not just into war, but into ritual, madness, vengeance, and hatred, as the word-bearers no longer sought just conquest, no longer desired conversion, but rather transformation, and the cost: worlds lost, armies scattered, and innocence devoured in all its forms. Still, the heresy marched on, with or without the word-bearers' will. As the siege of Terra engulfed the cradle of mankind in fire, ruination, and damnation, not all word-bearers remained within the Ultima Segmentum. A war host under the command of Dark Apostle Zurdu Layak took part in the apocalyptic battle on the birthplace of humanity, as he had aligned himself with the vanguard of the War Master's fortress. For 45 harrowing solar days, Terra became a veritable charnel house of blood and slaughter, to degrees inconceivable to the rest of humanity. The corrupted legions of chaos, both Astartes and Daemon, encircled the throne world like carrion birds. Amongst them stood the 17th Legion, ever preaching the very word of Lorgar. The Imperial Palace, a fortress the size of continent, defied their every advance. Titans of the Death's Head Legion would eventually crack the sanctified walls, and it would only be then, amidst the thunder and the collapsing stone, the shrieking warp storms, and the bloody tide, that the Emperor himself would meet Horus upon the vengeful spirit. What followed was not merely a duel, it was the very foundation from which the Imperium would either perish or endure evermore. With Horus now slain, the traitors scattered. Yet the word-bearers, bruised but far from broken, were able to mostly slip into the warp untouched by their loyalist counterparts. Their sanctuary became the very Eye of Terror's Maelstrom, a region where the materium bleeds into the very nightmares of the warp. There they raised a new capital, Sicaraus. Surprisingly not Cato Sicarius, but it was a demon world forged in their very image, defiant against reality and loyal only to Chaos Undivided. From here, they would launch 1,000 heretical attacks and 1,000 damnable causes. During the 41st millennium, the Iconoclast Brotherhood, a sect of word-bearers, would descend upon Conqueror's Dew, a planet built to glorify imperial triumph, which was strewn about with uncountable statues of the Emperor and the Primarchs, each of them massive enough to pierce the very skies themselves. To the Brotherhood, these were monuments to a false divinity. Melta charges and chains toppled them amidst the smoke of a full-scale planetary invasion. As Imperial Titans from Volnug's Cyclopean Legion counterattacked, the word-bearers unleashed a ritual in the name of Tzeentch, animating the very desecrated colossi with twisted mockeries of life. Though the Titans held the field, the Brotherhood's message had been carved into history. No imperial idol would remain uncontested, no world untouched. Once again, in M41, in the Invernus Sector, the Throdos Crusade, led by the Black Templars, was met with an equal and opposite force. The Word-Bearers, instigators of the sector-wide revolt, launched a war fleet of their own. Soon the conflict would escalate as demon hosts and other Traitor Legions alike poured into the fray. By the end, the sector was all but annihilated, as 6 worlds were reduced to mere radioactive ash, and the fires of 2 crusades burned out once again in M41. Nepthys Madrigal, a shrine world revered for its purity, was the target of a coordinated 2-pronged assault of heresy. The great unclean one, Vile Blight, sought to unleash the deathly pox. His efforts were swiftly sanctified and extinguished by the legendary and glorious Adeptus Sororitas. In his frustration, he called in an ancient debt from Cor Dredon, Dark Apostle of the Word Bearers. Unlike demons, these mortal blasphemers bypassed the wards of the world, launching a brutal offensive as altars fell and temples were reduced to rubble. The pox returned, and with it, legions upon legions of plague bearers, and so the planet was lost, one ward at a time. Once again, in M41, a vision received 10 millennia earlier during the Horus Heresy came to a dark fruition. Dark Apostle Joruk descended upon Tanakreg, where his cultists, long seeded into its society, had already begun their work, sabotaging the defenses and leading to the betrayal by corrupted PDF commanders. This would ensure that the word bearers would receive minimal resistance, as the surviving populace was then enslaved to construct a monolithic warp conduit. When activated, it shattered the planet's very crust, revealing a Necron stasis tomb below. This plan seems to have backfired upon the word bearers, as Jurak would then be slain by the Necron Lord who had been roused from his millennia-long sleep, though his first acolyte, Marduk, escaped with an artifact of unknown power. In one of their most chilling acts, the word bearers would later manipulate industrial cults into a scorching, massive 8-pointed star, creating a veritable sigil of chaos into the moon of Thranix. Soon after, the capital world below was racked by wave upon wave of demonic incursions and possessions. No military force could be deployed in time, and no message was sent. There wasn't even a battle. It was merely a proclamation. In essence, they spoke the legendary lines, "All your bases are belong to us." The scars of the heresy stretch far beyond the immediate centuries following the Siege of Terra, and further still into the 41st millennium, then even beyond that. The word bearers have not ceased their campaign of corruption and war, moving ever deeper into the shadows of imperial space. The records themselves, though fragmented and complicated by chronomantic errors in the imperial calendar, reveal a series of seemingly sporadic, random, or incredibly artfully planned out campaigns of corruption and war, each moving ever deeper into the shadows of imperial history, revealing a series of grim events that have left the Imperium to bear an unholy mark. In 920 M41, on the war-torn world of Clement, long ravaged by the cult of strife, an uneasy peace was brokered by Tau diplomats seeking to at least stabilize the planet. The majority of the populace accepted this rather fragile ceasefire, but the planet's elders and priests were keepers of an ancient faith who would protest vehemently. They insisted that the blood tithe must continue. This tithe was a ritual of sacrifice, an appeasement, which was deemed necessary to placate the darker forces. The Tau were puzzled, yet stood firm in their assimilation efforts. Yet they could not anticipate what came next. Before the Terranir was out, the word-bearers had arrived. Their forces descended with a merciless precision, almost as if they had seen what was to come. Chanting prayers to the dark gods, they slaughtered both human and Xenos alike. Disregarding all treaties, the Tau Firecast responded with a fierce counteroffensive, igniting a conflict far bloodier and more brutal than any ritual struggle of old. The war had been unleashed, and it stood as a testament to the relentless zealotry of the word-bearers, as the tithes were in essence keeping the world outside the purview of the word-bearers. So by stopping any protection from the dark powers the world had received were now null and void. On the frontier world of Grubol in M42, the word-bearers enacted yet another grim, elaborate, and complex ritual, a mass sacrifice not limited to humans, but also encompassing captured Orc freebootas, Eldari outcasts, and Tau ambassadors. Despite the desperate intervention of Craftworld Aldrake, the ritual was completed, and the Great Rift allowed a catastrophic warp scar to tear across the surrounding space lane, isolating Gurabol and condemning them to the merciless rule of the Dark Apostles who had orchestrated this calamity. At a later date in M42, on what appeared to be a deserted world, the word-bearers were dispatched by Abaddon the Despoiler to dismantle the Nullfield megaliths, ancient blackstone pylons scattered across the landscape. Their mission quickly devolved into a brutal ground war when a self-repairing swarm of canoptic scarabs unleashed by the Necrons counterattacked from beneath the surface. The word-bearers, cornered, outnumbered, and outgunned, summoned as many corn demons as they could. Their offerings were their own blood to break them free from the assault. Only then once their own blood tithe was met with scores upon scores of word bearers. Could their objective be met? Later still, in M42, the cult of impurity emerged along the Macarius pilgrimage route, born from the word-bearer's influence upon its mortal followers. Its acolytes bore a blasphemous mockery, a melted Adeptus Astartes purity seal branded above their hearts. Guided remotely by the Dark Apostles' cryptic portent, the cult flourished across the Segmentum Pacificus. This would allow them to grow in numbers and initiate a massive, multi-planet-wide, system-consuming civil war, pitting 6 loyal Space Marine chapters against legions upon legions of the lost and the damned, a cataclysm that reshaped the region in shadows and blood. Long after the climactic siege of Terra, Lorgar, the word-bearer's functionally apostate Primarch, withdrew into seclusion on the demon world of Sicaraus, locked in penance for his sins. Yet, as the 41st millennium waned and the Great Rift tore open the skies, birthing the Noctis Anathema, whispers emerged, sightings of Lorgar in a very terrifying new form, as his newfound grandeur seemed to surface across the mortal realm in ways prior thought unthinkable, leading veritable word-bearer war hosts marked by an even more unwavering zeal than ever before, as he preached the dark gospel of chaos with a renewed fury. However, he would have to contend with his now ascendant brother, Corvus Corax, who he himself had been freed from the confines of his traditional mortal form, seizing the power bestowed upon him by being a being born of a minor warp deity. Later still, in M42, in the Chronos Expanse, a cult dedicated to heresy took root in the Rykard system, under the sway of the rogue traitor house Winterscale. Led by a prophet named Aurora, the cult foretold of a climactic event, the Final Dawn. The planet's capital, Ryak Minoris, was then convulsed by an uprising as Aurora's followers targeted the electrodynamic Cenabrim, a temple of the Adeptus Mechanicus housing an ancient Archaeotech fusion reactor. A strike team led by a new rogue traitor from the von Veniglis dynasty quelled the rebellion, killing Aurora, only for the planet's sun to vanish shortly thereafter. The entirety of the star had been stolen by Drukhari warships, so it may be used in Comarag. Seeing this dark omen, the cult launched a final assault, as rogue traitors were forced to confront a word-bearer's champion at the very starport. The true Aurora was revealed to have been slain in brutal battle prior to this event, meaning the rogue traitors had no more reason to remain, as they fled with their forces, leaving the region weakened and vulnerable to further chaos incursions after they had pushed the word-bearer's champion and his forces out of the controlling point in the system. The tallest war would then occur during the Era Indomitus, where Kor Phaeron, now the Dark Cardinal of the word-bearers, unleashed a full-scale chaos invasion on the Tuldus system, a key ecclesiarchal stronghold in the Virtus subsector. The system's capital, the cardinal world of Benediction, was the primary target, but all inhabited worlds faced a series of coordinated assaults. Kor Phaeron forged alliances with an Iron Warriors warband led by warpsmith Etrigor and a Night Lord's fleet under Chaos Lord Yaris Kane. The invasion struck 3 fronts simultaneously: Benediction itself, the Astra Militarum fortress world of Greshdak, and the perilous void of the Tears of the Emperor asteroid belt. At Benediction, the word-bearers nearly overwhelmed the Grand Honorificum Cathedral City, but the faith of the defenders summoned miraculous psychic shields, now known as the Saint's Wall. This spectral defense shattered the demonic grip, allowing a demi-company of salamanders to counterattack and hold the city. On Greshdak, a Black Templar strike force destroyed the Soul Hunters' mobile fortress, though at the cost of the heroic death of Castellan Darmus. In the void, the Night Lord's piratical fleet sought to ambush Imperial shipping by manipulating astropaths to disrupt navigator sightlines. The arrival of the White Scar's Vanguard Marines turned the tide, forcing the pirates into a protracted guerrilla warfare conflict. Though the Imperium currently holds the system, the Taldus War is far from concluded, a testament to the word-bearer's enduring threat and their unrelenting, everlasting campaign to supplant the Emperor's light with the darkness of the ruinous powers. This grim litany of atrocities and conflicts revealed the Word-Bearers' persistent presence across millennia, a veritable legion in numbers still, not merely of warriors, but of zealot. Their crusade is one of relentless spiritual warfare, their tools terror, corruption, and sacrilege. Their quest is only limited by the question of how many more worlds must fall before this tide of darkness is stymied. The ever-shifting saga of the Word-Bearers finds its dark apex in the ascension of its Primarch Lorgar, as he was indeed transformed from a mortal warlord or a demigod into a fully fledged demon primarch, a being of godlike power having a veritable, nigh immortal form. His transformation was no quiet affair, as it is said that his birth scream, which heralded his rise as an incredibly powerful demon prince of chaos undivided, echoed violently across the entirety of the Imperium. A triumphant declaration of faith, his form now renewed with immortality and the unfathomable power of the Imperium coursing through his every molecule. Since that momentous event, Lorgar has sequestered himself within the foreboding fortress known as the Templo Infinico, located on the demon world of Sicaraus. For thousands of Terran years, he has refused all summons, dedicating himself to a meditative communion with all four of the dark gods. This isolation allowed the Word-Bearers to be governed by a ruling body known as the Dark Council, comprised of the Legion's most potent and prolific Dark Apostles, their equivalents to Loyalist chaplains, but far more insidious in both power and influence. Unlike many other Traitor Legions, the Word-Bearers have notably resisted fracturing. Instead, they remain as a single, if loosely organized, military entity. The Dark Council governs their affairs, but it is riven by a constant struggle for supremacy between two dominant forces, one led by Erebus, the first chaplain and Dark Apostle, and the other by Kor Phaeron, the keeper of the faith. This uneasy rivalry shapes their legion's destiny. From their twin power bases on Sicaraus and the factory world of Ghalmek, nestled deep within the Maelstrom, the Word-Bearers unleash chaotic wars of faith upon the Imperium time and time again. These campaigns are not mere battles for territory or resources. They are in fact, spiritual crusades intended to enlighten humanity by supplanting the worship of the court emperor with the veneration of their true deities, the Chaos Gods. Billions have perished in this war for souls, but for the Word-Bearers, such losses are a necessary sacrifice to bring forth the truth first sought by Lorgar to the galaxy at large. On every world they assault, the legions sow seeds of heresy, nurturing a web of chaos cults that will one day rise to further their crusade. This relentless spread of corruption occasionally pits them against the Alpha Legion, another secretive and insidious traitor faction. Or they might be secretive yet insidious loyalists, pretending to be traitors. With the Alpha Legion, one can never be too sure of anything. While the Word-Bearers and the Alpha Legion have occasionally united, most notably during the devastating Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler, they more often exist as bitter rivals, as their schemes constantly clash beneath the surface of the greater galactic conflict. One remarkable incident saw Lorgar briefly breaking his self-imposed seclusion to aid the Word-Bearers against a mysterious adversary, a monstrous entity hunting them with lethal intent. This creature was ultimately revealed to be Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Loyalist chapter, the Raven Guard. The Raven Lord himself was warped and mutated by the powers of the warp emanating from the core of his very being. In his relentless crusade of vengeance against his fallen brothers, Corax had awakened the true core at the center of the Primarch's being, minor warp deities sequestered by the God Emperor and turned into his sons. This has allowed Corax to access the wide breadth and scope of said former deity's essence, allowing him to perpetually contend with the forces of entities like demon primarchs without repose. In a brutal duel, Corax dominated the confrontation, forcing Lorgar to retreat like a coward through the very warp portal from which he had arrived. The portal closed as Corax's chilling promise lingered. As he spoke, Lorgar understood. He had gained Lorgar's scent and would hunt him down to kingdom come and trumpet sound, no matter where he fled. Yet these encounters, as fierce and personal as they were, only served as temporary distraction. The Wordbearers' war against the Imperium remains a total and unconsuming, relentless, and unyielding affair. Their goal is absolute in their minds, hearts, and spirit, as they seek to destroy every symbol of the false emperor until they topple the corpse emperor from his life-sustaining golden throne, and the eventual liberation of humanity from the shackles of false faith. Only then do they believe that mankind will truly understand the truth of chaos. As the 41st millennium draws to a close and the Era Indomitus dawns amidst the birth of the Great Rift, it seems rumors have spoken that Lorgar has finally freed himself from his seclusion, as witnesses claim to have seen him walking amidst the mortal realms in a terrible splendor, leading vast, uncountable warbands of wordbearer hosts, preaching the dark gospels of chaos with a renewed zeal and an unshakable conviction. Alongside the Black Legion and the Death Guard, the wordbearers are amongst the rare Traitor Legions that did not shatter into competing warbands following the Horus Heresy. Instead, under the strict rule of the Dark Council of Sicaraus, they have remained centralized, making it so that despite the fact that the wordbearers are not the most prolific of combatants within the legions, their numbers and their unity has allowed them to maintain a punch similar to that which they had during the Horus Heresy. This infernal priesthood enforces a rigid regiment of worship towards the Chaos Pantheon, compelling complete obedience through fear and devotion alike. Dark Apostles often lead their own armies called hosts of varying sizes, from equivalent to loyal Space Marine companies to encompassing the full force or even surpassing that of the largest chapters of Space Marines. As they stand now, each host is uniquely structured and shaped to the whims of their Dark Apostle leaders, under the purview of the Dark Council and, supposedly, more often than not, in the current era, the will of Lorgar. Such unpredictable changes often produce formations that appear as tactically unwieldy or inflexible. However, the word bearers accept these alterations without question, viewing them as a divine will of the warp. The largest recorded host numbered well over 2,000 Chaos Space Marines and potentially surpassed even the numbers of the Black Templars. Such a force required the Dark Apostle to be served by two chief lieutenants who became known as acolytes, along with a champion known as Coryphaus. The Coryphaus act as an intermediary between the apostle and the host, assuming the responsibility of tactical decisions on the battlefield, while the apostle remains focused on communing with the ruinous powers and fueling his warriors' hatred, along with contemplating the greater strategy of the campaign. Within the host's ranks, an icon bearer carries a sacred symbol of faith, and an elite cadre of Terminators called the Anointed form a devastating spearhead. A typical host will generally resemble a Space Marine company divided into squads of roughly 12 warriors each, commanded by a word-bearer's champion aspiring to equal the Dark Apostles' seal, leadership, and potentially usurp their position. Many hope to one day inherit the Dark Apostle's mantle upon his death, though some may act upon their own desires to accelerate that day's coming. As the galaxy has now been torn asunder, the word-bearers endure the unrelenting tide of time and space. As priest warriors who are driven by a faith darker than any other, their mission remains unchanged across millennia: to tear down the lies of the false emperor and to illuminate the galaxy to the terrible truth of chaos. The question remains, how many more worlds will fall under their shadow before their relentless crusade finally meets its end?